afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and on behalf of Channel 23 and our sponsor, Intrepid Potash, we want to welcome you to the Artist Gallery. And we're here every so often to let you know that you're going to meet people that you might know, people that you might have never seen before, and we call the program The Faces of Carlsbad. And if you've watched our show in the past, and many people have, you're probably familiar with some of the people we've dealt with. For example, we've been doing business with Jay Jenkins. You might have seen Jay Jenkins. Randy Milligan. I'm sure you've seen Randy. Rita London, principal at many of our schools. Pat Mack and Jay Melnick. So you never know who you're going to see on the Faces of Carlsbad. And today we're very privileged to have as our guest Mr. What's your name again, sir?
Joe Epstein.
Oh, I didn't know that. Joe Epstein. I knew a man in Carlsbad by that name. Are you related to him?
Pretty closely.
Oh, okay. Joe, it's a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
We try to throw a little humor into these shows because some people fall asleep.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, we don't want that to happen.
We don't want that.
Because you've got a lot to say to the public today. And I want to start our show off, Joe, with the early days, where you were born, your background of your family, and we'll take it up to the present day.
Born in St. Louis, as well as my wife, Barbara, St. Louis. Went off to the Naval Academy and really never returned to St. Louis after that.
Let me stop you for one moment. Where were your parents originally from?
St. Louis.
Oh, all St. Louis.
Right.
I see.
Yeah. Now, their relatives were Iowa, Illinois, but my mom and dad were born in St. Louis as well.
So your relatives in the past could have come over on the Mayflower.
Probably not the Mayflower. No, I don't think. I had gone to Ellis Island, and I looked up on the database that they have for everybody that has been sponsored that came through Ellis Island. And there was no Epstein from Germany.
Yeah.
And they were all Polish and Russian. So I suspect that the port of entry, because there's a big batch of Germans in the Midwest, and that was probably the entry port of Galveston. That's what I think. Because there's a whole batch in Texas and then up through Missouri and so on.
Yeah.
But apparently not through Ellis Island. No.
Oh, I'll be darned. That's amazing.
Yeah. My dad's grandfather or great-grandfather was the immigrant to the United States, and he was a von Epstein, which was probably Prussian.
Yeah.
And but that was dropped when he came to the United States.
But that meant that you were a very famous family back in those days.
No, it was probably landowner. Yeah. I've never traced that back.
Frederick of Epstein. Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
You could have been related to von Bismarck.
My dad actually had a book, which I still have. Haven't read it, but it was Queen Louisa of Prussia. And in that book, one of her aides or whatever was a von Epstein. Yeah.
Well, I'll be. Isn't that something?
Right.
I've never been able to reach a family that was that high up. Most of mine came from the slums of Dublin, Ireland, and the city of Prague in the Czech Republic.
Right.
So anyway, you were born and grew up in St. Louis, Missouri.
Right. South St. Louis. And my wife was right on the edge of Italian Hill, St. Aloysius Parish, right on the edge. And Italian Hill was where Yogi Berra, Joe Garagiola, they all came from there. As a matter of fact, not very far away from where my wife grew up.
So many famous Italians came
Oh
from that
my
section.
gosh, yeah. Italian Hill, the best Italian food.
Oh, yes.
Oh my gosh, just a tremendous amount of restaurants. Yeah.
Well,
really nice.
I was just talking to somebody today, and they said that the Italians are famous for two things, wonderful food and beautiful women.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and here you married a very lovely lady, Barbara.
Thank you. Yeah.
So that's, why did they call it St. Aloysius? How did the Irish get in there?
Oh no, this was Italian Aloysius.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right, right. Yeah. Now the big parish on Italian Hill in St. Louis is St. Ambrose.
St. Ambrose.
Right. But St. Aloysius was right on the edge. So since been closed down.
Oh, it has been.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Things have changed.
Oh my gosh.
Do you ever get back to St. Louis?
Oh yes, the whole family is there on both sides, except for my wife and her sister, who's in Denver, and myself. But my brothers and sisters still there, and her three brothers are still there in St. Louis.
Oh my goodness,
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Right.
Well, listen, you mentioned the fact that after you graduated from high school, you applied for the Naval Academy. Was that it?
Right. Well, I was in St. Louis University for a year, and then off to the Naval Academy. And with graduation and commissioning into the Navy, then on to sea duty and so on and so forth. So never really returned to St. Louis, though a lot of visits back to visit the families and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. When you were accepted in the Naval Academy, that's a very elite group because not many people are accepted into the Naval Academy.
Yeah. Good program.
Yeah, you hit the jackpot.
Good school.
Absolutely.
Right.
So after you graduated from the Naval Academy, what happened?
Well, got into the nuclear submarine, Navy nuclear submarines. And that was really a year and a half worth of training. 1 year is spent in academic classes, or was. They've changed this since then, but you spent 6 months in nuclear power subjects, schools, and then 6 months at a prototype, which is a land-based replica of an operating nuclear plant.
I see.
And at the prototype, you have to learn all the systems and essentially get qualified to be able to operate the nuclear reactor and all the stations like electrical systems and mechanical systems and so on. Same thing that you would find aboard ship on a nuclear submarine.
So you basically were assigned, you were a graduate as an ensign, correct?
Yes, right.
And then as the years rolled along, you became, what were the signs? A lieutenant and a captain?
Sure, lieutenant commander.
Commander.
Well, it's ensign, lieutenant, JG, junior grade, then lieutenant, then lieutenant commander,
Okay.
commander, captain.
And you reached the top echelon.
Well, that's not the top echelon because there is flag rank, so the admirals are.
We won't talk about them. No, we'll just keep that quiet.
Okay.
But how many years did you spend on nuclear subs?
I was active for 8 years and then 22 years in the reserves.
Now, what years were you active in the Navy? Because I want to bring something up.
62 to 70.
Oh, you missed me then. I was on the destroyers in 1970 through
Yeah.
1977.
Yeah, we were tracking destroyers. No, no.
Yes, well, you know, I felt that way. You know, I was on the Sutherland and on the west coast and the Steinecker on the east coast. And one night, as the destroyer was going along, we hit a storm off the coast of North Carolina. And the officer on watch asked if I'd like to steer the destroyer. And
Right.
he looked back after about 5 minutes and saw that it was weaving back and forth. And he said, "I think that's all, Shoal. You can sit down." And I felt like somebody was stalking us underwater. It could have been you,
Oh, boy.
but we didn't serve at the same time.
Yeah. No, I was on the fleet ballistic missile submarines. There's two basic types of submarines, the attack boats and the fleet ballistic missile submarines. So I was out on patrol, and you stay down for a couple of months and always undetected and, you know, submerged. So
Did that ever take a toll on the men, some of the men on the boat?
there were a couple of instances where I saw someone that got kind of a long-term claustrophobic effect. You're really screened out for anything that would represent acute claustrophobia. But there were a couple of submarines that were lost, the Thresher being one of them.
Were you in the service when that happened?
Oh yes, yeah. As a matter of fact, here's a bunch of newly married ensigns reporting for prototype duty up in Saratoga, New York, and we're all in the motel and huddled together, and we're listening to the news releases that the Thresher went down, and the wives are starting to think, what did we get ourselves involved with here? Yeah. We were sure that they were on an operation and would be fine, but
what
they weren't.
actually happened to the Thresher? I remember that.
A seawater system, a weld, a braze joint probably let loose, and they were just out of the shipyard, and they were testing the submarine and so on, and they probably lost the reactor caused by some spray from flooding and so on and so forth. And when they didn't recover the propulsion system, they couldn't recover the ship because there was too much water being taken on.
And it went down and
Right.
lost the entire crew.
Right. Yeah.
And I understand the Russians had the same problem with one of theirs years later. Submarine
Yes.
duty has to be very frightening, though, to a lot of seamen, due to the fact that if one goes down, chances of survival are very, very small.
Well, it depends upon the depth, of course, but there is all sorts of training if for escape if it went down in relatively shallow water, but not in the depths of the ocean.
Well, I remember during World War II, the Germans had an outstanding submarine force, but they lost close to 65% of their submarines.
Oh,
And
yeah.
those survivors felt very lucky that they were able to make it without injury.
Yeah, the advent of both radar and operations analysis led to just spotting, tracking, and killing off the German submarines that were tracking convoys and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Well, just recently, I heard that the United States built an air base down on the Galapagos Islands during World War II to protect the Panama Canal from Japanese submarines. And that air base is still used today for commercial aircraft, but not for the United States Navy. But these are things I did not know about until just recently.
Now, you were just down in the Galapagos, weren't you?
Yes, I was. It was quite an experience.
Yeah.
And to see these magnificent tortoises and sea lions
my
who
gosh.
have survived all these years, it's unbelievable, Joe.
Right.
It really is.
It's wonderful.
Now, it had to take a toll, though, on the wives, and for example, your wife, Barbara, because you were gone for not just days or weeks, but we're talking about months.
Right.
And you have to admire the women whose husbands are out at sea, especially on submarines.
Yeah. Well, that's so true. The submarine force really takes care of its own very well. On a strategic missile submarine, there's actually two crews, a blue and a gold crew. And the wives whose husbands are out on patrol are really looked after by the other crew, especially the wives. So there's really a very nice organizational camaraderie between the two crews, and especially the wives taking care of each other when the spouses are going off to sea.
Oh, that's
yeah,
nice.
it's really wonderful. Yeah.
So you were
And that helped.
active service for how many years then?
8 years.
8 years. And then you were 20 years, did you say?
22.
22 in the reserve.
Yeah, I retired with 30 years.
30 years
Right.
altogether. Oh my
Right.
gosh. And then what drew you to Carlsbad?
Well, when I resigned my commission, I went to work for Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, and in the commercial nuclear power business. And that was a number of jobs, including going down to Florida, the Tampa, Florida, Tampa plant of Westinghouse, working on a steam generator for a breeder reactor for Department of Energy, and then came back to Pittsburgh. And after Pittsburgh, I went out to Hanford,
In
to
Washington?
the Washington State. Hanford is in the southeast of Washington State, Tri-Cities area, and the topography, everything is very similar to southeast New Mexico. It's actually deserty, and though Washington is the evergreen state, the southeast of Washington is actually quite treeless and deserty. And there I was working on low-level waste. Hanford was used during the war for production of plutonium. And now there's cleanup going on. And my job was associated with some of that cleanup, low-level waste cleanup. And that kind of waste management involvement led to me getting a call concerning WIP and coming here for the transuranic contaminated waste cleanup and burying in a half a mile down in the salt, which is happens to be just a wonderful media because it entombs anything that is any excavation that is done in the salt in which something is placed, like waste. That entombment in about 150 years is almost back to the original state, about 95% of the theoretical density. And salt doesn't let anything escape. You can hardly pass anything through salt.
I didn't
It's
know
wonderful media.
Yeah. So you got back here and you got to work, and,
Right.
and then you decided to retire after a while, was that it?
Yes. This is after we got open in '99.
Yeah.
But the contract was being rebid, and very similar to what is done on these rebids, they bring a team in to kind of refresh and so on. So suddenly I was didn't have a job, and talked with the vice president down in Aiken, South Carolina, and he had a few potential jobs. And one of them was on up in the Baltimore area at Edgewood, which is an Army facility.
That's where,
and this
that's where I had my Army training,
Yeah.
Aberdeen Proving Grounds, very close to
That's
Edgewood.
right. That's it. And this was on chemical weapons destruction,
Oh, yes.
cleaning up of all of that.
Right.
And so I was up there for not too long, year and a half associated with that. And we had our home on the market but hadn't sold it, and decided to retire and come back to Carlsbad. And so retired here.
You just had that great desire to get back to Carlsbad.
Well, you know, the time.
It grows on you, Joe.
Yeah,
It grows
the time at WIP, you know, I knew a lot of people, a lot of friends. This is a very good environment and a hearty stock of people, and volunteerism is high. People helping each other, very common, and it's just a lot of cities you can go to. People don't look at each other. They, passing without turning their heads, and here it is kind of a wave and a hi and There's obviously people who have different opinions,
Right.
but whenever you ask for help, and it could be somebody that you're in a contest with, just like that, you know, people are very good to each other here.
They really are.
Yeah.
And let me ask you another thing. Since you've retired, you're busy doing something. Fill me in on, in the few moments we have left, what are you doing now that you're
Well,
retired?
one thing I have is a shop where I'm doing some woodworking and a little bit of welding. And I've built furniture, mainly cabinetry for the kids. Then there's a number of organizations in Carlsbad that I'm involved with. I believe important organizations for Carlsbad. One is a construction trades program.
That's at the high school?
At the high school.
Yes.
The students are actually building the house, and we sell it as an affordable home. That's called CCDC, Carlsbad Community Development Corporation. But then there's a coalition against drugs and gangs, which is very, very important, and involved with that. And really almost connected with that, the Boys and Girls Club, which I'm on the board of for many, many years. When I was involved with the coalition, I learned how vital the Boys and Girls Club is to many of these children who would otherwise not have something to do.
Right.
A number of them are in the poverty area, a number of them in the single parent area, and they would be ripe for being involved with drugs and gangs, except for the sake of the Boys and Girls Club. Very important.
Well, I go over there once a month with my little contribution,
Right.
and the place is always packed.
Right.
And the people working there are so nice to
Oh,
me.
yes.
They always make me feel good. You know, I
Yeah.
just leave that place feeling
Yeah.
happy.
Yeah,
And
and
you're
we
also-
have a mural project in Carlsbad also that is very important for really making the town just look more beautiful. Murals on buildings, and we're going to see a lot more of those.
Oh.
And that's a wonderful pursuit.
That's wonderful.
It's good for even developing the arts and crafts, because we're going to have some Boys and Girls Club youngsters who are going to go through the whole process, and they may be kind of a force for future murals
Yeah,
and so on.
right.
Really.
Well, in the moment we have left, I'd like to say I've seen some of your woodworking abilities and the things you produced. Absolutely amazing.
Thank
you have
you.
your shop down in your cellar, or?
Oh no, I bought a little place over on 8th in Missouri, and I was it was suggested by my wife that I ought to find some shop, because
Yeah.
the last project, when I was building a bunch of cabinets for my son in Chicago, we filled up the garage with these cabinets and so on, and to stain and varnish them, we had to clean out the living room, took everything out except for this great big hutch, and we had tarpaulins down, and that's where the staining and varnishing was going on. And after that, Barbara said, I think you ought to find a shop.
And women, when women say move, they mean move, right?
Right.
Joe, I want to thank you for being our guest today. It's been wonderful, and I really do appreciate it. And as one sailor to another, of course, you were an officer and I was just a poor enlisted man, but it's a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
On behalf of Channel 23, goodbye and good luck.